The sky wept as thunder grumbled above the scorched fields. On the edge of the village, where the wind never quite settled, a woman stood barefoot in the ash, her arms lifted to the storm, her long black hair tangled with the wind, her eyes fixed on the heavens, not blinking. At her feet lay the villagers' offerings, flowers turned brittle, candles drowned in their own wax, and a single child's ribbon torn down the middle. No one dared step closer. From behind the shuttered windows, they whispered, "She called it. She called the storm." A streak of lightning cracked across the horizon, not toward the sky but downward, as if answering her. And just before the wind swallowed the world whole, someone swore they saw her lips move, not with rage, but with a lullaby. It wasn't always this way. Once she laughed in the orchard under sun-dappled trees. Once, she braided ribbons into her daughter's hair while the village smiled. But that was before secrets were unearthed, before love turned its back, and before a single word, witch, took root like poison in the soil. Subscribe now, because tomorrow's story will haunt you even deeper. You'll need it. But before that, let me take you to the day it all began. They called the town Whistler's Hollow, though no one could remember why. Maybe once wind used to sing through the canyon. Now, it only scraped. Dust clung to everything. To shutters that never opened, to the faded white steeple that no longer rang a bell, to the boots of men who walked straight past her without a nod. Even the clouds, when they came, moved slowly, dragging themselves like old regrets across the sky. On the farthest edge of Whistler's Hollow, just before the land split into gullies and thornbrush, sat a crooked cottage with blue shutters that had peeled to gray. Smoke curled from the chimney only on Mondays and Thursdays, when she made bread and when she lit the herbs her grandmother once taught her to dry. They called her Etta, not to her face, but in tight circles, between sips of weak beer or as children passed each other dares. Bet you won't go near Etta's gate. She's got crow bones under her porch. Mama says if you stare in her eyes too long, your dreams go bad. No one remembered where the rumors began. Maybe they'd always been there, passed like heirlooms, too precious to examine, too old to abandon. But they grew louder the day she returned with a baby on her hip and no husband in sight. That was 8 winters ago. She came limping back after the first frost, her left foot dragging slightly, her hem soaked in mud, her coat 2 sizes too large. The townsfolk peered through their curtains and whispered. Not a single soul offered her shelter, not even old Marla, who once sold her blackberries as a child. Etta said nothing. She never did. She moved into her grandmother's abandoned cottage, the one people said was cursed, where the apple trees never bore fruit and the dogs never lingered. She repaired the roof with her own hands, carrying timber on her back, though her shoulder never sat quite right. She didn't ask for help. She didn't knock on doors. And so, Whistler's Hollow did what it always did with things it didn't understand. It turned away. They avoided her in the market, set prices higher when they saw her approaching, or worse, lowered their eyes and acted like she wasn't there at all. When she passed, conversations thinned, smiles vanished. Even children were taught to avert their gaze, as if looking too long might curse them too. But Etta had her daughter. Lena was sunlight caught in a bottle. Where Etta moved with the careful stillness of someone always expecting to be struck, Lena ran with wild joy. Her laugh echoed down the canyon trail and made the crows lift from the trees. She was the only one who spoke in the house, and she spoke enough for both of them. At first, the town tolerated her. Children played near the fence, tossing flowers or skipping stones. Lena's curls bounced as she spun in circles, humming songs only she seemed to know. But it didn't last. One day she brought a bird back to life, or so the town said. A robin lying still in her small palms, eyes glassy. By the time her mother came from the garden, the bird was fluttering again, perched on Lena's wrist like a secret. Word spread faster than fire. The next week, no one came near the fence. 2 mothers pulled their sons away when they neared the path. Someone carved a cross into her gatepost. Another left a dead rat on the doorstep. They began to call her a witch, too. Etta never corrected them. She'd learned long ago that explanations meant nothing to people who had already decided who you were. They didn't care that her limp came from a childhood fever that left one leg a little shorter than the other. They didn't care that her silence was not cruelty, but caution, that she read lips better than she spoke, and only used her voice when she had something sacred to say. Her quiet became a canvas they painted monsters on. Even the preacher began to hint from the pulpit about unnatural women who strayed from the path and bore strange fruit. Though he never named names, no one needed him to. His gaze always drifted toward the hills, and Etta. She gathered her child and walked home the long way. There was a kind of peace in being alone, once the pain of exclusion dulled to habit. In the evenings, she and Lena picked herbs from the stone garden and pressed flowers between old book pages. She made tea that soothed bruises and pastes that cooled burns. Her hands were steady, practiced. She didn't need much, only quiet, only safety. But even that was too much to ask from a town that had already decided her fate. Sometimes Lena would ask, "Why don't they like us?" And Etta would pause, the kettle steaming between them. "They don't know us, baby. But we're nice. They're afraid of what they don't understand. Is that why they call you a witch?" Etta's eyes would flick to the window. Maybe. But witches were women once, too. She didn't tell Lena about the man she loved, about the night he left with promises of return, about how the letter she received months later was signed by someone else's name, claiming, "He died a hero in a war he never meant to fight." She didn't speak of the way her body ached after childbirth alone, or how she learned to listen for the earth's rhythm because no one else would offer guidance. No, some pain she packed away quietly, like folded linen no longer used but never thrown out. And so the days passed. Etta grew quieter. Lena grew bolder. And the town grew colder. Until one morning, the sky cracked open above Whistler's Hollow. Not with rain, but with sound. A thunder so deep it shook loose the nails from the chapel beams. Birds fled. Windows shattered, and at the edge of the canyon, Etta stood with both hands raised. But that is a story for later. First, we return to the beginning, to a town that feared silence, a woman who carried too many truths, and a daughter who refused to be hidden. The wind in Whistler's Hollow changed the day the stranger arrived. Not in the way a storm does, loud and sudden. No, this was the kind of change that moves quietly beneath your skin. A hush that slips in through the cracks, a feeling that makes birds pause mid-song. He came on horseback. No one rode horses anymore, not since the dirt roads turned to stone. But he did. A black mare with white socks and a gait too elegant for a place like this. His coat was long, dusty, but the shoulders sat proud. He didn't look around like he was lost. He looked around like he remembered. His name was Callan. He passed the general store, the chapel, the schoolhouse, all slow, not speaking, only watching. People watched back, of course, they always did. But not the way they watched Etta. With him, there was curiosity, not contempt. They wondered who he was, what he wanted. He didn't carry a bag, didn't ask for directions, just tipped his hat when spoken to and moved on. He stopped near the edge of town, where the path thinned and the brush thickened, where whispers always grew louder. There, near the sagging fence and crooked blue shutters, he dismounted. And Etta, who was pulling weeds by the rosemary patch, felt the wind shift. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt, eyes narrowed. Her daughter wasn't home. She'd gone walking by the creek, collecting feathers again. Etta's shoulders tensed. Visitors didn't come here unless they wanted something, or meant harm. But this one only watched her. Not cruelly, not with the half-hidden revulsion others barely bothered to disguise. He just said, "You've got time growing wild at the edge. Most folks wouldn't let it spread." Etta tilted her head, read his lips. The wind played tricks, so she always watched closely. "Most folks don't know what time is good for," she said quietly. Her voice was rough, unused, like the pages of an old book cracking at the spine. He smiled, not wide, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth. A quiet acknowledgement. She didn't invite him in. He didn't ask, but he came again. The next day and the next, always with a small reason. A question about soil. A request for a balm. He had an old burn that flared when the wind changed. She gave him comfrey and lavender. He didn't flinch when she touched his hand. They didn't speak much. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch rail while she worked in the garden. Sometimes they'd both just watch the sky for a while. Lena liked him. She said he smelled like pine needles and old tobacco. She made him laugh once, really laugh, and Etta hadn't heard that sound in years. Still, she watched him. Careful. She trusted no one, not fully, not even the wind, especially not the town, because the town was watching too. The shopkeeper asked why he was spending so much time up there. The preacher began speaking again of wolves and borrowed wool. Even Marla, who hadn't looked Etta in the eye in nearly a decade, mentioned it while shelling peas with her neighbor. Strange for a man to spend time with her. You think it's for the girl or the land? The stranger didn't seem to care. Or if he did, he didn't show it. He once brought Etta a book, an old herbal, spine cracked, pages full of pressed leaves and margin notes. Found it in a box at the trading post, he said. Thought you'd like it. She didn't say thank you. She just opened it right there and ran her fingers along the edge of a drawing. A moonflower. She hadn't seen one since her grandmother's funeral. That night after Lena fell asleep, Etta lit a candle and read for hours. Her lips moved as she mouthed the words. Old things, familiar things. The stranger was waking something in her. Not love, not yet. Something older than that. Something like recognition. He saw her, not as a warning or a wound, but as a woman still breathing, still choosing. And that, perhaps, was more dangerous than anything, because danger was creeping in. The town didn't just whisper now, they acted. A goat found dead near her fence, throat torn but no blood left behind. Children dared each other to throw stones at her gate. One hit the window. Lena cried for the first time in weeks. Etta didn't retaliate. She never did, but she burned rosemary in the windowsill, drew salt lines by the door. She knew how fear moved, like wildfire. You couldn't fight it directly, only shape the wind around it. Callan saw the broken glass and said nothing, but the next time he came, he brought wire for the fence. Not to fix it, just to make it harder to breach. Is that your answer to them? She asked. He shrugged. It's not for them. It's for you. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the things they didn't need to say. That night, thunder rolled once in the distance, low and thoughtful. Etta turned toward the sound and listened like she understood its language. The wind shifted again, and somewhere beneath the hills, something ancient stirred. They watched her for weeks. Like buzzards circling, waiting for something to die. Etta felt it in her bones, the shift from suspicion to plotting. Not loud, not messy, but careful, precise. It started with Lena. She came home crying one afternoon, her little hands trembling, her hair tangled with burrs. Someone had shoved her near the creek, said her mama didn't belong here, that she was a witch's child and her eyes would curse the crops. Etta held her until the sobs melted into sleep, then sat by the fire until dawn, unmoving. Her eyes flickered, with something unreadable, not rage, not sadness, something older, something tired. She tried to stay quiet after that, even softer than before. She stopped walking into town altogether. She sent Callan away when he came one morning, tea in hand. Not today, she said, not meeting his eyes. He didn't push, just left the tea by the gate and walked off. Slow, as always, but silence didn't protect her. The town had already made up its mind. It was near harvest when they came, a knock on the door at dusk. 5 men, no uniforms. Whistler's Hollow didn't have lawmen, but their shoulders were straight, and their mouths were hard. The preacher stood at the back, watching, always watching. We've had enough of your curses, one said. I haven't cursed a thing, Etta replied, even and low. You let the child run wild. You whisper in the fields. Cows are dying, and folks are afraid. Then they should speak to the butcher, not the woman with rosemary in her pocket. They didn't like that. One stepped forward and grabbed her arm. She didn't scream, didn't fight. She knew better. Lena sobbed, trying to cling to her, but another man held her back. They dragged Etta through town, not with ropes, with shame. With eyes, they brought her to the chapel, not for prayer but for spectacle. Sat her in the center of the pews, lit candles around her like she was already a memory. And there, in front of the town, the preacher spoke. He called her wicked, called her unnatural, said she was luring men with potions and corrupting their daughters with wildness. Callan wasn't there. They made her speak, and when she didn't, when she stayed still as frost, they called that defiance too. Then Marla stood and told the story she'd been saving. She said Etta seduced her brother once years ago, said he went mad not long after, hung himself in the stable. She gave him something, I saw it, a vial with black oil. Etta blinked, just once. She'd never even touched Marla's brother, but truth didn't matter here, only the shape of fear. That night they didn't hang her. They weren't bold enough, but they locked her in the old storm cellar near the church, the one that hadn't held anything but rotted crates in years. No window, only stone and cold, and the memory of damp. She didn't scream, but the moment the lock turned and the last footstep faded, she let herself fall. Not gracefully, not poetically, just down. Her knees hit stone. Her fingers curled like roots desperate for soil. She pressed her forehead to the floor and breathed until it hurt. She didn't know what time it was when the door creaked open. At first, she thought, it was memory, her mind playing tricks again. But then came the smell, pine needles and smoke. Callan. He said nothing, just knelt beside her, placed a rough hand on her back. They stayed like that for a long time. I didn't come to rescue you, he said finally. I came because you don't deserve to sit alone in the dark. Her throat tightened. I told them I was leaving, said I'd had enough. But the horse wouldn't move. She kept turning back. Guess even beasts know when something's wrong. Etta let out a soft, cracked laugh. It sounded more like a question. He didn't offer help, didn't beg her to come. He just waited. Eventually, she stood. Her limbs ached, her breath came thin, but she rose. Callan led her out into the night. They didn't run. They walked. Past the chapel, past the silent windows where curtains fluttered like guilt. Back to her house. The garden had been trampled. Someone had taken a torch to the rosemary. But the thyme still bloomed under the fence. Inside, Lena was asleep in the root cellar. Callan had moved her there before he'd gone to find Etta. Just in case, he'd said. Etta knelt beside her. Daughter brushed a curl from her cheek, then she stood and turned to Callan. I'm not what they say, she whispered. I know. They think I was born wrong. They're afraid you were born right. She looked at him like no one had looked at her in years, like she was trying to believe him, like she didn't dare. They thought she was broken, he said softly. But someone saw gold in the ashes. She closed her eyes, and something in her chest, something sealed for years, cracked open just a little. That night, thunder rolled again. But this time, it didn't wait in the distance. It walked closer. It echoed through the hills like a voice remembering its name. And Etta? Etta stood tall at the window, watching, listening, not hiding, not afraid. Because something had changed, not just in her, but in the air, in the sky, in the wind that was no longer whispering, but answering. The town didn't come for her the next morning. No torches, no crowds, but they didn't forget either. Windows stayed shut as Etta and Callan passed. Doors clicked closed with the wind. The silence that followed them wasn't empty. It was full of watching. But something was different now. Etta no longer bowed her head. She moved like someone who had remembered how to stand. And Callan? He didn't shield her. He stood beside her. They began quietly, as most real things do. He brought tools. She brought seeds. Together they mended the fence around the east pasture, where weeds had long taken hold. Lena helped, small hands planting sprigs of lavender where nettles once grew. It wasn't a grand rebellion. It was bread baking again, horses grazing again. Laughter sometimes, when Lena made faces at the goats. They turned the scorched garden into a greenhouse. Callan cut beams. Etta lined them with glass salvaged from the old mill house. At night, it shimmered like stars had fallen into their yard and chosen to stay. Some said it was foolish, rebuilding where everyone still glared. But they weren't rebuilding the town. They were rebuilding themselves, and fire was returning. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that warms. Still, the past has a way of finding you. It arrived one afternoon in late September, when the air smelled of smoke and endings. A rider on a dun-colored horse. Broad shoulders, a hat dipped too low. Callan saw him from the gate and froze. Etta saw it too, not the man, but the change in Callan's spine. A stillness, like the moment before lightning. He didn't speak until the rider had gone. "My brother," he said. "Didn't expect him to come. What does he want?" Callan stared at the path where hoofprints sank. Me to come back, to fix things I broke, or to punish me for the ones I didn't. Etta didn't push. She just handed him a mug of tea. The same kind he used to bring her. That night, he told her. He'd been the sheriff's son, raised on law and pride. But he'd turned away after a fire, the one that killed a boy who hadn't deserved it. They blamed him, Callan said. But I lit the match, or maybe I just stood by while others did. I left, couldn't stay where justice meant silence. Etta didn't speak. She reached for his hand and he let her. They didn't talk about it again, not in words. But every fence they fixed, every tomato they grew was an answer. Still, storms don't always come from the sky. One morning Lena collapsed, a fever so sudden it felt like a curse. She burned, whispered nonsense in her sleep, and clung to her mother's hand like a shipwrecked soul. Etta tried everything. Sage, elderberry, cool cloth soaked in creek water. Callan rode to town, hat in hand, asking for help. But the apothecary said her herbs weren't for that child. He came back with nothing but dust on his boots. For the first time in years, Etta panicked. Her hands shook, her words failed her. "She's all I have," she whispered. "She's all of me." Callan stayed at her side. Day and night. He read to Lena, even when her eyes stayed shut. Stories about stars and silent horses. Then one morning, Etta heard a sound she hadn't heard in days. Lena whispering. "Mama?" Her voice was dry as paper, but it was there. Etta wept, cradling her, thanking every herb and ghost and whispered prayer she had ever known. The fever broke, and something else broke with it, something in the town. The blacksmith's daughter came with a basket of pears, left it by the gate, no note. A boy ran up 2 days later and tossed a doll over the fence. "For Lena!" he shouted, then ran before anyone saw. Then the preacher's wife came. No sermon, just silence. And a jar of honey. People weren't apologizing. Not yet, but they were remembering something deeper than fear. Humanity. Still, one challenge remained. Callan's brother returned. This time, he didn't ride in. He walked, hat in hand. He stood at the greenhouse door while Etta clipped rosemary, her eyes sharp. "I need to speak to him," the man said. Etta nodded and called for Callan. They spoke under the willow tree, voices too low to catch. But later, Callan told her, "He wants me to come back. Said the badge was always mine, that people remember who I was." Etta looked at him, heart heavy. "What do you remember?" she asked. He was quiet. "I remember fire," he said. "And silence, and shame," she nodded. "And now, I remember this," he said, motioning to the garden, to Lena, to her. I remember what it means to build something you're willing to stay for. He didn't go with his brother. He stayed, and together, they built more. A stable for rescues. A bench near the greenhouse for old women to rest on their walks. Clay oven that baked bread anyone could smell, whether they dared knock or not. They still weren't welcome in the chapel. But children came to the garden for stories. Etta never called herself a healer, but somehow, things bloomed where she walked. Not magic, just love. The fire had returned, and it was hers now. The spring came early that year. The winds softened. The trees wore blushes of green. And for the first time in many seasons, the town did not speak her name in fear. They spoke it softly, hesitantly, like trying out a word they once thought cursed. Etta, the preacher's son, came by one morning with fence nails. The mayor's sister left tulips by the greenhouse door. And when Callan held her hand in the marketplace, right there, in full view of the butcher, the clerk, the banker's wife, no one flinched. Still, she didn't smile. Not quite, because the choice had not yet been made, not fully, not loudly, not clearly. He had chosen her in silence, in sweat, in soil, but not in the light, not in the place where judgment still lingered like ash. Until one Sunday morning, he walked to the chapel, alone, boots thick with mud, hands ungloved. He opened the door mid-sermon. Heads turned. The preacher paused. Callan said nothing, just looked across the pews, then straight to the front. "I won't be sheriff," he said, not loudly but steady. "Not for a town that forgets mercy." He turned. "And if you ever want to find it, again, you'll know where we are." Then he left. No one followed, but no one stopped him either. And that day, he walked through the square with her hand in his. Not in shadows, not in shame, in daylight, and the sky did not fall. That evening, they returned to the land, to the place where it had all begun, where Lena first planted lavender, where thunder once answered her cry. The air smelled of lilac and riverstone, and under the silver hush of twilight, Callan brought out a ribbon. Simple, soft, the color of spring dusk. He didn't kneel. She didn't cry. He only said, "You never needed saving. But I'd be proud to stand beside someone so unafraid to bloom where fire once lived." She took the ribbon, tied it around her wrist. "I never thought I'd be someone would choose," she said. He shook his head gently. "No, you were always someone worth choosing. I just needed to learn how to see." They didn't marry. That night, they promised to build, to tend, to try. And a month later, they stood under the stars, near the broken oak tree. It had grown green again, somehow. No crowd came, just the blacksmith, the boy with the doll, the baker's niece, and Lena, carrying a basket of rosemary. No veil, no pews, just earth beneath their feet. Firelight in the distance, and each other's hands held like anchors in a world that had once tried to drown them. The stars blinked approval, and in the hush after vows, someone whispered, "She was never a witch," and someone else, "She was a mother," and another, "She was hope. We just didn't know how to name it." They never built a chapel. They didn't need one. Instead, they built a library out of stone and timber, where stories of old women and thunder and lavender and quiet miracles could live. And sometimes, on summer nights, travelers came, sat by the fire, shared their own tales, and when they asked for names, Etta would smile. "Just call me the one who stayed," she'd say, "the one who chose the light, even when it wasn't offered." Lena grew tall, wise-eyed. She liked to braid her hair with rosemary and sky-blue ribbon. One day, she asked her mother what the townspeople used to call her. Etta only smiled. "Nothing worth repeating," she said, because her name had never been witch. It had always been miracle, just waiting for the